We'll pick up with our look at gentrification by answering the question, how does gentrification take hold? And we recognize where gentrification is taking place, why it is taking place, and who is involved. Now we're going to look at how gentrification takes place. Early on, gentrification begins with what is known as sweat equity, where a lot of the early gentrifiers, the dinks, sometimes known as the pioneers, enter communities and they start to rehab, they start to upgrade the properties by themselves. So they'll do it on their own, they'll pay for it, they'll hire friends or people they know. It's not a mass commercialized renovation of a neighborhood. So sweat equity early. And some of our earliest gentrifiers are artists, are individuals who recognize that intrinsic value, the attraction to this neighborhood, while it's still an area that's working class or poor or industrial. As the area becomes more trendy, businesses start to arrive. So consumer demand starts to grow as more and more people enter the area. Our dinks, our yuppies, our people with more disposable income are now living here, and the business community recognizes that this is a place to start a new restaurant, to cater to people with time and money to spend. As the city recognizes the growth of the neighborhood, they then begin to offer tax incentives, different types of tax breaks to renovate a house. Many cities have historical renovation taxes where if you buy a house, say for $100,000, and you put $200,000 into it to make it a very nice property, the city might only tax you on the original purchase amount because they're promoting your investment. Likewise, they're going to attract businesses. So businesses, if a business renovates a space or builds on a space that was abandoned, they're going to charge them taxes on the initial property value. So to keep that cost down, to promote investment in the community. We also see, after a couple of years, flipping and displacement. So as the sweat equity begins to transform the place, as bars, restaurants, gyms, places to spend, again, your money and your time as they begin to populate the neighborhood. Tax incentives bring business in. We start to see this snowballing effect, this positive kind of cumulative causation occurring in the neighborhood. So people that were there early begin to flip their properties. Many of the longtime residents begin to become displaced, again, either through economic or social means or both. We see this transformation usually takes about 2 years. It's a quick process. A neighborhood gets hot, as it would be recognized in the real estate world. And we see that neighborhoods that are gentrified are often followed by a second wave of gentrification. And that second wave of gentrification will often displace the original gentrifiers. And as the neighborhood's popularity continues to increase, we see expansion into nearby neighborhoods. So we think back to that example of Park Slope. As Park Slope became more and more popular, it priced out the gentrifiers initially, or ultimately rather. And then after pricing out the first wave of gentrifiers, the new round of gentrifiers come in, higher income, higher education, oftentimes from not only New York City, but other places around the country and around the world. So gentrifying neighborhoods become these destinations for outsiders. The power of gentrification, the force of gentrification will also push in a wave-like manner into surrounding neighborhoods. And as it pushes into surrounding neighborhoods, we begin to see the process start over with that sweat equity, the popping up of new businesses, tax incentives, flipping and displacement. And as the gentrification process takes hold, we begin to see all these aspects occur. So the results of gentrification, pros and cons are often tied to the stakeholder. So the city is often happy with gentrification because it's growing their tax base. It's welcoming, inviting new businesses. But we can't just look at the economic benefit. We have to look at the social costs and benefits. For the longtime residents, many times they're displaced. They lose that sense of place. Some longtime residents enjoy gentrification. They find it as a means for new economic opportunity and integration. So pros and cons isn't as simple as it may seem. It's often tied to the stakeholder. How does your situation change as a result of gentrification? We see again economic growth, the tax base expands, the money for funding parks and schools and roads and services grows. We covered recently how when a city goes into social and economic decline, these services lose funding. Gentrification is a way to bring that investment back. And we see that early years is often highlighted by integration and excitement. But all too often, the long-term result is social and economic displacement and segregation. So again, your stakeholder position will often define how you benefit or how you suffer from gentrification. Again, as social scientists, we need to recognize some of these costs, and some of these costs are significant. When we talk about social and economic displacement, we're talking about more than a few people or a few households. Many times we're talking about communities of hundreds of households that could be displaced. And what we often don't see with gentrification is a tracking of where do these people go? What is the result? How are their lives playing out? So again, just to revisit the neighborhood where we started, Park Slope, we can now answer the what, why, who, where, and how of a community like Park Slope. 1960, Baltimore's Inner Harbor. Again, when we look at the situation in Baltimore in 1960, we see that the city was in the early years of deindustrialization. Suburbanization had already taken hold. We saw an increased investment in highways. The highways that are in this graphic were never realized because of the resistance from downtown communities that said, while we may not be economically standing out, we're still places of community. So they were able to fight the highways that went through. And in the years that followed, the downtown area became known as a place to go through, not to. But by the 1980s, we started to see this renewed interest. Along the waterfront, we saw gentrification start to take hold. Again, where it was happening, these quintessential small neighborhoods located along the water, sites of former industry, sites of former immigrant enclaves. These places had charm. And what we find is a very different view of Baltimore's downtown today. Just east of Inner Harbor, we have the community of Canton. Showed this image earlier. In the 1980s, Canton was in the waning years of its industrial period. And we see the American Can Company here. Again, much of the building was shuttered. It was a warehouse located just off a rail line that ran down the middle of the road. We recall from an earlier part of this term, Zukin's places of production to places of consumption. And we see the physical and social transformation that's taken hold in this area. From a mostly abandoned can manufacturing site to a mixed-use building that caters to a walkable community, has businesses such as Outback, high-end restaurants, lots of places for disposable income and free time. Just to the east of Inner Harbor, between Inner Harbor and Canton, we have Harbor East. And Harbor East was a former rail yard until the 1990s. Sorry about that. It was a former rail yard until the 1990s. Today, we don't see images like this of rail cars lining the streets, buildings that are sites of production or sites of storage. We see remnants of the past, but again, we see that replacement of places of production to places of consumption. In this area today, we have high-end apartments, condominiums, hotels, retail stores, dining options, a total transformation that reflects the economic and social changes that took place in this community. And we'll wrap up by looking at this neighborhood in Los Angeles. Highland Park has been a long time Hispanic neighborhood since the 1960s. This neighborhood began to see Black and Hispanic residents move in when the suburbs began to expand outward from downtown LA. And for decades, Highland Park was basically an enclave, an immigrant enclave, a small community. But in recent years, we've seen interest as Los Angeles has become increasingly expensive. We see communities like Highland Park become destinations for gentrifiers. It's a unique place. There's lots of culture. The proximity to downtown is ideal. A lot of those quintessential neighborhood themes are in place. What we're finding is that a number of residents in Highland Park are actually embracing gentrification. They're seeing this as a way to keep their social clubs, keep their businesses, like the one pictured here, Hermosillo Club, which is now patronized by a different group, but the ownership of the business is the same. So we start to see the economic benefits and the increased diversity, the social and economic diversity that has been a positive for this community. We see a Korean church and a food truck, right? The food truck is a symbol of gentrification. The food trucks arrive in neighborhoods as disposable income increases. And we see the original community that is part of the Korean American community in Los Angeles practicing their faith in the neighborhood. And this image shows the 99-cent only store in a Starbucks. Two of the big signs of gentrification in a working class or lower income community are the arrival of Starbucks and Whole Foods. And right here we see Starbucks now open, but we also see the 99-cent store catering to the longtime community. So gentrification, again, there are pros and cons. It's not a simple topic. It's not a simple issue. It depends oftentimes on who you are. And again, as social scientists, we are often concerned with the displacement of people. Where do they go? What's next? How detrimental is this place detachment, right? You're leaving a place where you've lived your entire life, where perhaps your family goes back generations. And as that changes around you and the people are different, the sense of place is different, perhaps you can no longer afford to live there. That could be a very damaging experience for a lot of people. The example of Highland Park, again, they're looking to promote integration and stave off that displacement. So they've actively been fighting for affordable housing in ways to keep people in the neighborhood that have been there for generations. And our final image takes us to the Chelsea neighborhood in West London to show us that gentrification isn't just an American concept. Again, it originated in England. And the Chelsea neighborhood is becoming a very hot international market where this former middle-class community is now unrecognizable except for some of its physical buildings. And a quote from a recent article said that they're no longer places to live, they're places to store global money. So people are investing in these physical properties because the value is accelerating so rapidly. So rather than invest in stocks or bonds, people are just buying properties in this neighborhood, leaving them empty and allowing the prices to escalate. So gentrification, it's a complex topic. It's something that we see happening all around us. It's something that maybe you've experienced growing up, and many of you will likely move to gentrifying or gentrified neighborhoods when you graduate from college.